Hi, I'm Victoria Hayes, and 3 weeks ago my family threw a party to celebrate me finally moving away for good. They had champagne. Patricia made her famous spinach dip, and Stephanie even bought a cake that said Bon Voyage Victoria in cheerful pink frosting. What they didn't know was that, while they were toasting my departure, the President of the United States was reviewing my file for the most powerful legal position in the country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 27 years of family dinners where I was the afterthought, the one who thinks she's better than everyone, the daughter who chose law school over staying close to home. They said I was cold, ambitious, disconnected from what really mattered, but when my phone rang at 6:47 a.m. last Tuesday with a call from the White House, I realized they had been right about one thing. I was different. I just never understood how much that difference was worth. Tuesday mornings in Denver have a particular quality that I've grown to appreciate over the past 8 years. The Rocky Mountains catch the sunrise in a way that makes even the most mundane federal courthouse look majestic. And my corner office on the 20th floor gives me a view that most people pay vacation money to see. I had earned this view, this office, this life that I built brick by careful brick, case by case, conviction by conviction. My coffee was still steaming when the first email of the day appeared in my inbox. The sender's name made my stomach drop before I even read the subject line. Stephanie Hayes Crawford, with her hyphenated surname that she wore like a badge of suburban achievement, had sent a group message to what appeared to be half of Naperville, Illinois. Victoria's finally taking the hint. Farewell party. This Saturday. The exclamation point felt like a knife. I clicked open the message, my hands steady despite the sudden coldness spreading through my chest. The email was vintage Stephanie, bubbly and backhanded in equal measure, with enough emoji hearts to stock a greeting card factory. Hey everyone, as you all know, Victoria has finally decided to move away from Denver for good. After years of missing family events, holidays, and basically everything that matters, she's taking a position that will keep her away permanently. Mom and I thought this was the perfect opportunity to throw her a proper send-off party and celebrate this new chapter for all of us. Saturday at 3 p.m., bring your appetites and your dancing shoes. It's going to be such a relief to finally have some peace at family gatherings. RSVP by Thursday. I read it twice, then a third time, each pass revealing new layers of casual cruelty. The way she described my life's work as missing everything that matters. The emphasis on finally, as if my absence was a gift they'd been waiting decades to receive. The phrase, such a relief, hit particularly hard, confirming what I had suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. They weren't just indifferent to my success, they actively resented it. The responses had already started flooding in. Aunt Carol with her laughing emoji and about time. Uncle Jim with maybe now Patricia can stop worrying about her. Even my mother's bridge club friends were chiming in with variations of congratulations that felt more like condolences for a burden finally lifted. But it was the response from my mother herself that made my breath catch. I'm just grateful we can finally stop pretending we understand her choices. This distance might be exactly what we all need. I set the phone down carefully as if sudden movements might shatter something more fragile than the screen. Through my office window, Denver sprawled below me in the crisp October morning. A city that had welcomed my ambition, rewarded my dedication, and never once made me feel apologetic for wanting more than what I was born into. My assistant knocked gently before entering. Victoria, your 9 a.m. is here and I have those files from the Morrison case ready for review. I nodded, slipping back into the professional mask that had served me well for so many years. But throughout the morning, as I argued motions and reviewed evidence, Stephanie's words echoed in the background of my thoughts. Finally taking the hint, as if my 8 years as a federal prosecutor, my law degree from Northwestern, my spotless conviction record, and my recent promotion to Deputy Attorney General were all just elaborate ways of avoiding family barbecues. The irony was that they weren't entirely wrong. I had been avoiding them, but not for the reasons they thought. I stayed away because every visit home felt like stepping into a house where the air itself was designed for smaller lungs, where conversations about my work were met with polite disinterest or thinly veiled criticism about my priority. I stayed away because watching Patricia introduce Stephanie as my daughter who's doing so well with her real estate business while introducing me as Victoria, who's still doing that lawyer thing in Colorado, made me feel invisible in my own family. But their celebration of my departure stung in ways I wasn't prepared for. It confirmed that the distance I felt wasn't just geographical or professional, it was fundamental. We were operating from entirely different understandings of what success looked like, what family meant, what love was supposed to feel like. I had built a life in Denver that felt authentic, challenging, meaningful. I prosecuted cases that mattered, sent criminals to prison, protected victims who couldn't protect themselves. I had respect from colleagues, fear from opponents, and a reputation that opened doors across the country. But to them, it was all just an elaborate way of missing Christmas dinner. The Morrison files lay open on my desk, but my mind kept drifting to childhood memories that I usually kept locked away. I remembered being 12 years old, winning the state debate championship, coming home with the trophy clutched in my sweaty palms, and finding Patricia in the kitchen making dinner for Stephanie's volleyball team. "That's nice, honey," she had said without looking up from the casserole. "Can you set the table? Stephanie's friends are coming over to celebrate her making varsity." I remembered high school graduation, where I delivered the valedictorian speech to a packed auditorium, while my family sat in the third row. Patricia checking her phone and Stephanie whispering to her boyfriend. Afterward at the reception, everyone wanted to talk about my speech, my college plans, my full scholarship to Northwestern, but Patricia spent the evening introducing people to Stephanie, who was graduating with a 2.8 GPA and no particular plans beyond community college. The pattern had been there all along. My achievements were inconveniences, interruptions to the family narrative they preferred to tell. Stephanie was the golden child because she stayed close, chose, safe, needed them. I was the disruption because I wanted more than what Naperville could offer, because I asked questions that made everyone uncomfortable, because I refused to shrink myself to fit in spaces that were too small for my ambition. By lunchtime, the sting of Stephanie's email had crystallized into something harder and more useful. Anger, yes, but also clarity. They wanted me gone. They thought my distance was finally permanent. They were celebrating their relief at not having to pretend to understand my choices anymore. Fine, let them celebrate. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my assistant. "Please schedule a meeting with the partnership committee for next week. I want to discuss the possibility of opening a satellite office in Washington, D.C. If they wanted distance, I would give them If they wanted permanence, I would make it permanent, but I would do it on my terms, with my ambitions leading the way, not their limitations pushing me out." The afternoon passed in a blur of case preparation and strategic plan. I found myself sketching out possibilities, connections I could leverage, opportunities I had been too comfortable in Denver to seriously consider. The idea of Washington had always been a someday dream, but Stephanie's email had turned someday into now. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie Rodriguez, my college roommate, who now worked as a journalist covering federal law enforcement. "Saw the Morrison conviction made national news. You're making waves. Coffee soon." I typed back quickly, "Actually, yeah, and I need to talk to you about something else. Are you still connected with people in DC?" Her response came immediately, "Very connected. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time for a change." That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking downtown Denver, a glass of wine in hand, and my laptop open to job listings I had never seriously considered before. Deputy positions at the Department of Justice, senior prosecutor roles that came with security clearances and caseloads that could reshape federal law, opportunities that would take me not just away from Naperville but into a stratosphere of legal work that would make my current position look like small-town practice. The city lights twinkled below me, each one representing someone living their own version of ambition, compromise, or surrender. I had never felt the pull to leave Denver this strongly before, But something about my family's enthusiastic celebration of my departure had shifted something fundamental in my chest. They were so eager to see me go that they were throwing a party. They were so relieved by the prospect of permanent distance that they were inviting the whole neighborhood to celebrate. Well then, I would give them something worth celebrating. I opened a new email and began typing. Dear Stephanie, thank you for organizing a farewell party. You're right that this move will be permanent, and I appreciate you all being so supportive of this next chapter. I look forward to seeing everyone on Saturday. I didn't mention that I hadn't actually accepted any position yet. I didn't mention that their party had transformed a vague consideration into a concrete plan. I didn't mention that their relief at my departure had just guaranteed that it would happen exactly as they hoped. Some truths were better delivered in person, some distances were worth traveling, and some celebrations deserved to be exactly as permanent as the hosts intended. Saturday would be interesting, but first I had phone calls to make, connections to leverage, and a future to build that would make their little party look like exactly what it was, a small suburban celebration of their own limitations, hosted by people who had never understood that the daughter they were so eager to lose had always been destined for something far beyond what they could imagine. The wine was good, the view was spectacular, and for the first time in years, I felt the electric anticipation of a plan forming. They wanted Victoria Hayes to finally take the hint and leave for good. Message received, and I was about to make sure they understood exactly what they had wished for. Wednesday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that makes Denver feel like the top of the world, but I barely noticed it as I walked into the grind, my usual coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse. Natalie was already there, her curly black hair pulled back in a messy bun, and her laptop open to what looked like 3 different news articles. She waved me over with the kind of smile that suggested she had been thinking about our conversation all night. I've been making calls since 6 a.m., she said without preamble, sliding a printed list across the small table. Your timing is either terrible or perfect, depending on how you look at it. I sat down and scanned the list. Names, positions, phone numbers, email addresses, all Washington, D.C., all federal law enforcement or Department of Justice adjacent, all the kind of connections that could turn a Denver prosecutor into a D.C. power player with the right introduction. Terrible or perfect? How? I asked, signaling the barista for my usual. Perfect, because there's movement happening right now, 3 senior positions opening up, including one that would be custom-made for someone with your background. Terrible because the timeline is aggressive. If you're serious about this, you need to be serious right now. Not next month, not after you think about it. Now. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone she used when she was about to share information that hadn't made it into print yet. There's a reorganization happening at Just. The current Deputy Attorney General is moving to private practice, and there are rumors that the Attorney General position itself might be opening up sooner than expected. The President is looking for prosecutors with federal experience, spotless records, and the kind of political instincts that can handle confirmation hearings. My coffee arrived, but I barely tasted it. Political instinct. Victoria, you've been prosecuting federal cases for 8 years, without a single overturned conviction. You've handled organized crime, white-collar fraud, domestic terrorism cases. You're clean, you're competent, and you're photogenic enough for the Sunday morning show. More importantly, you're from the heartland with a law degree from a respected school. You check every box they're looking for. The list in front of me suddenly felt heavier. These weren't just job opportunities. They were the kind of career moves that redefined what was possible, that took someone from regional success to national influence. The kind of positions that came with Secret Service details and congressional testimonies, and Senate confirmation hearings. What's the catch? I asked. Natalie grinned. The catch is that you have to want it badly enough to move fast. First round of interviews are happening next week. If you're interested, I can make the introduction today. But Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. She closed her laptop and looked at me directly. Are you running toward something or away from something? Because DC will chew you up if you're just running away. The question hit harder than I expected. Was I running toward the challenge of federal prosecution at the highest level, toward the opportunity to shape policy and precedent? Or was I running away from family dinners where my achievements were treated like embarrassing hobbies, from a life where my own mother publicly celebrated my permanent departure? Both, I said finally. I'm running toward the career I've been building for 8 years, and I'm running away from people who celebrate that career like it's a character flaw. Natalie nodded slowly. Good answer. Because the people I'm about to put you in touch with will ask harder questions than that, and they'll spot a lie from 3 time zones away. She handed me a business card with a DC phone number. James Mitchell, Deputy Chief of Staff, Northwestern alum, former prosecutor, and the person who vets candidates for senior justice positions. I told him about you this morning, and he wants to talk today. If that goes well, you could be on a plane to Washington by Friday. I stared at the card, feeling the weight of a decision that had somehow made itself. 48 hours ago I had been a successful prosecutor in Denver with a family who tolerated my success. Now I was holding a business card that could change everything, and that same family was planning a party to celebrate my departure. There's something else, Natalie said, pulling out her phone. I did some digging into your family's social media after our conversation yesterday. Your sister posted about the party on Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn. She's making it very public that you're finally leaving for good. She showed me Stephanie's LinkedIn post, and my stomach dropped. Excited to announce that my sister Victoria is finally taking her career in a direction that will keep her closer to where she belongs. Sometimes distance is exactly what families need to grow. Celebrating this new chapter for all of us. The post had dozens of likes and comments, most from people I recognized from childhood, neighbors, family friends, even some of my high school teachers, all congratulating Stephanie on my departure, all expressing relief that the family could finally move forward and stop worrying about Victoria's choices. She's basically announcing to your entire hometown that you're unwanted, Natalie said quietly. She's making your departure into a public celebration of family harmony restored. I read through the comments, each one a small knife. Patricia must be so relieved. Now maybe holidays can be normal again. Sometimes the black sheep needs to find their own pasture. Families work better when everyone knows their place. The last comment was from Mrs. Patterson, my 3rd grade teacher, a woman who had once told my parents that I was gifted but difficult to manage in group settings. Even she was celebrating my ex. I handed the phone back to Natalie and picked up James Mitchell's business card. Make the call, she dialed immediately, and I listened to her side of a conversation that would reshape my life. Professional charm, strategic name-dropping, the kind of networking magic that opened doors in Washington. When she hung up she was smiling. Interview tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Video conference first, then if they like what they see, you'll be on a plane Friday morning for in-person meetings all weekend. The speed of it all should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like momentum, like a machine that had been waiting for me to push the right button, and now all the gears were turning in perfect synchronization. I spent the rest of Wednesday and all of Thursday preparing research into current Justice Department priorities, review of my case record, phone calls with former colleagues who could provide references. By Thursday evening, I felt as ready as anyone could be for a conversation that might redefine their entire career. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mitchell, I said, I'm interested in the position that would change my life completely. His smile was the kind that suggested I had just passed a test I didn't know I was taking. Pack a bag, Victoria. You're going to Washington. Friday morning I stood in Denver International Airport with a single carry-on bag and a sense that I was crossing a threshold that had no return path. The mountains were visible through the terminal windows, snow-capped and majestic, a reminder of the life I was potentially leaving behind. My phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Mom, made your favorite dessert for the party. Well, what used to be your favorite anyway? We're all so excited to finally send you off properly. I typed back. Looking forward to it too. This weekend is going to be full of surprises. The boarding announcement for my flight to Reagan National echoed through the terminal, and I realized that in less than 24 hours, I would either be flying back to Denver for a family party that celebrated my departure, or I would be staying in Washington to begin a career that would make their celebration look prophetic in ways they never intended. Either way, tomorrow was going to be very interesting, and for the first time in years I was the one controlling the narrative. Washington, D.C. in October carries an energy that feels electric, as if the autumn air itself is charged with ambition and possibility. I stepped off the plane at Reagan National into a world that hummed with a different frequency than Denver, where conversations happened in code and every handshake carried the weight of potential consequences. The city sprawled before me like a chessboard where I was about to discover whether I was a pawn or a queen. James Mitchell met me at the curb outside baggage claim, his government sedan idling with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't his first time collecting potential candidates from the airport. He was younger than I had expected, maybe early 40s, with the sharp-eyed alertness of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. "Victoria, welcome to Washington," he said, extending a firm handshake. "How was the flight?" "Turbulent," I replied, though I wasn't entirely referring to the weather. He smiled knowingly as we pulled away from the terminal. "First time in D.C. for government business. First time in D.C. for anything that matters this much." The drive into the city was a masterclass in strategic conversation. James talked about the current political landscape, the challenges facing the Justice Department, the kind of cases that were keeping senior prosecutors awake at night. But underneath the professional briefing, I could sense him evaluating my responses, testing how I handled complex information under pressure. "Tell me about the Morrison case," he said, as we crossed the Potomac. "I've read the files, but I want to hear your perspective on why it mattered." I had prosecuted dozens of federal cases, but Morrison was the one that had defined my reputation. A complex fraud scheme involving defense contractors, congressional staffers, and enough money to fund a small country's military. The kind of case that could make or destroy a prosecutor's career, depending on how they handled the political pressure. Morrison mattered because it proved that no one is untouchable, I said carefully. The defendants thought their connections would protect them. They thought Washington was a place where influence mattered more than evidence. They were wrong. 3 senators called the Attorney General asking for leniency during your prosecution. 4 senators, I corrected. Senator Williams called twice. James's eyebrow raised slightly. "How did you know about that?" "Because I made it my business to know. When you're prosecuting people with that level of political connection, you have to understand the pressure your superiors are facing. You have to be prepared for every angle of attack, including the ones that come through back channels." We pulled up to a nondescript building in downtown, the kind of government architecture that was designed to blend into the background while housing some of the most important conversations in the country. James led me through security checkpoints that involved more scanning and verification than most international airports. "Before we go upstairs," he said, as we waited for the elevator, "I need to ask you something directly. Your family's situation has come up in our background research." My stomach tightened. "My family's situation, your sister's very public celebration of your departure, your mother's comments about finally having peace at family gatherings, the general narrative that you're disconnected from your roots, difficult to manage, too ambitious for your own good." The elevator doors opened, but James didn't step inside. He was studying my face, watching for my reaction to having my personal humiliation laid out as a professional concern. "In Washington," he continued, "family dynamics become political narratives. Opposition research teams will find those social media posts, those public comments. They'll paint you as someone who can't maintain personal relationships, someone whose own family is relieved to see them go." I thought about Stephanie's LinkedIn post, about the comments celebrating my departure, about Miss Patterson's observation that families work better when everyone knows their place. Then I thought about 8 years of federal prosecutions, of criminals sent to prison, of justice served despite political pressure. "Miss Mitchell," I said, "my family celebrates my ambition as a character flaw because they've never understood that some people are built for bigger things than what they were born into. They see my success as a rejection of their values because they can't imagine values that include wanting to change the world. If opposition researchers want to use my family's small-mindedness against me, they're welcome to try. But I'd rather be criticized for being too ambitious than celebrated for being comfortably mediocre. James stepped into the elevator, and I could see the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Good answer, because upstairs you're going to meet people who will ask much harder questions than that. The 15th floor looked like the set of a political thriller, all dark wood paneling and portraits of former attorney generals staring down from the walls with expressions of stern judgment. James led me through a maze of offices where serious-looking people spoke in low voices about matters that probably determined the fate of nations. Conference room C, he said, stopping outside a door that looked identical to every other door we had passed. There are 3 people inside who want to meet you. Deputy Attorney General Sarah Chen, who would be your immediate supervisor if you take the senior prosecutor position, Chief of Staff Williams, who reports directly to the Attorney General, and someone else whose presence should tell you how seriously we're taking your candidacy. He opened the door, and I stepped into a room that felt like the epicenter of federal law enforcement. The 3 people seated at the polished conference table represented more collective power than I had ever been in the same room with before. Deputy Attorney General Chen was younger than I had expected, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that radiated from her posture. Chief of Staff Williams looked like Central Casting's idea of a Washington power broker, silver-haired and perfectly pressed, with eyes that suggested he had seen every variation of political ambition, and wasn't easily impressed. But it was the third person who made my breath catch. Attorney General Catherine Morrison, the most powerful prosecutor in the country, looking at me with the kind of attention that suggested this conversation would determine more than just my immediate future. Ms. Hayes, Attorney General Morrison said, standing to shake my hand. Thank you for making the trip on such short notice. Please, have a seat. The next 2 hours were the most intense professional conversation of my life. They asked about my prosecution philosophy, my approach to managing high-profile cases, my thoughts on the balance between federal oversight and local jurisdiction. But they also asked about my media strategy, my ability to handle congressional testimony, my thoughts on the political dimensions of law enforcement. The position we're considering you for, Deputy Attorney General Chen said, would put you in the national spotlight in ways that regional prosecution doesn't prepare you for. Every decision you make becomes a political statement. Every case you prosecute gets analyzed by cable news panel. Every public appearance gets scrutinized for signs of partisan bias. Are you prepared for that level of visibility? Chief of Staff Williams asked. I thought about my family's celebration of my departure, about their relief at finally being able to stop pretending they understood my choices. I've been preparing for this my entire career, I said. I've just been doing it in a place where no one was paying attention. Attorney General Morrison leaned forward. Tell me about a time when you made a decision that you knew would be unpopular but that you believed was right. The question felt like a test, and I knew my answer would either end this conversation or take it to a level I hadn't anticipated. I thought about the Morrison case, about the political pressure to go easy on defendants with congressional connection. But there was another case, one that had generated less national attention but more personal cost. 3 years ago I prosecuted the mayor of Lakewood for fraud, I said. He was stealing from a fund meant to provide services for veterans. The evidence was overwhelming, but he was popular, connected, and the prosecution was going to hurt a lot of people who had believed in him. What made it unpopular? Chen asked. My father had served under him in Vietnam. The mayor had given the eulogy at my father's funeral. Half of my hometown thought I was betraying a family friend for career advancement. The other half thought I was showing off, trying to prove I was tougher than anyone expected. I paused, remembering the phone calls from relatives, the newspaper editorials questioning my motives, the way Patricia had refused to speak to me for 3 months. I prosecuted him anyway, I continued, because stealing from veterans is stealing from veterans, regardless of who does it or who gets hurt by the consequences. The law doesn't have a friendship exception. Attorney General Morrison exchanged a look with her colleagues that I couldn't read, but it felt significant. Ms. Hayes, we're going to be direct with you. There are 2 tracks you could take from here. The senior prosecutor position we originally discussed, which would be an excellent career move and appropriate recognition for your experience." She paused, and I sensed that everything in my professional life was about to change. "Or," she continued, "we could discuss a different opportunity, one that would require Senate confirmation, extensive background investigation, and a complete restructuring of your life, but one that would also put you in a position to influence federal law enforcement policy at the highest level." Chief of Staff Williams leaned back in his chair. "The president is looking for a new attorney general, someone with prosecutorial experience, political instincts, and the backbone to handle congressional oversight. Someone who can be trusted to make difficult decisions without worrying about popularity or political consequences." The room fell silent, and I realized they were offering me something that went far beyond what I had imagined when I boarded the plane in Denver. Not just a senior position, but the senior position, not just influence over federal law enforcement, but ultimate responsibility for it. The timeline would be aggressive, Deputy Attorney General Chen said. Nomination announcement within 2 weeks. Confirmation hearings starting immediately after. "If you're interested, the president would like to meet with you Sunday morning." I thought about Stephanie's party happening tomorrow, about Patricia's relief at my permanent departure, about Mrs. Patterson's comment that families work better when everyone knows their place. Then I thought about 8 years of building a reputation that had led to this moment, sitting in a room with the most powerful prosecutors in the country, being offered the opportunity to shape justice at the federal level. "I'm interested," I said. Attorney General Morrison smiled for the first time since I had entered the room. "Then let's talk about what happens next." The rest of Friday passed in a blur of background briefings, security clearance paperwork, and conversations with people whose names I had only seen in news articles. By evening I was sitting in a hotel room in downtown DC, staring at my phone and the dozens of missed calls from Stephanie, all leading up to her latest text message. "Where are you? The party is tomorrow and Mom is freaking out that you're not answering your phone. You better not be planning to skip your own farewell party." I typed back, "I'll be there." Something came up, "But I'll definitely be there for the celebration." Something had indeed come up. The possibility of becoming the youngest attorney general in recent history, of overseeing federal law enforcement for the entire country, of having a platform to influence policy and precedent in ways that would outlast any political administration. Tomorrow, I would fly back to Chicago for a party celebrating my departure from my family's life. What they didn't know was that by the time I arrived, I would already be well on my way to a departure more permanent and more significant than anything they had imagined. Some celebrations deserved to be exactly as prophetic as the hosts intended, and some distances were worth traveling, especially when they led to destinations that redefined what was possible. The view from my hotel window showed the Capitol building lit up against the night sky, and for the first time in my life, it felt like something I might actually belong to rather than something I was just visiting. Tomorrow would be interesting, but first, I had a phone call to make to the President of the United States. Saturday morning in Chicago arrived with the kind of gray October sky that made everything feel muted and expectant, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I had flown in on the earliest flight from DC, my phone buzzing with messages from Stephanie about last-minute party preparations, and passive-aggressive reminders about bringing something to contribute to the celebration of my own departure. The rental car felt strange after 2 days of government sedans and official transportation, a return to civilian life that felt temporary in ways I was only beginning to understand. As I drove through the familiar suburbs toward Naperville past the strip malls and chain restaurants that had defined my adolescence, I felt like I was traveling backwards through time to a version of myself that no longer quite fit. My phone rang as I pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store where Stephanie had insisted I pick up ice for the party. The caller ID made my stomach drop, then immediately lift with a kind of electric anticipation I had never experienced before. "Miss Hayes, this is President Harris." The voice was unmistakably familiar, the same one I had heard deliver State of the Union addresses and press conferences, but now it was speaking directly to me, in a tone that was both formal and surprisingly warm. "Miss President," I managed, stepping out of the car and finding a quiet corner of the parking lot, Thank you for calling. I wanted to speak with you personally before tomorrow's meeting. Catherine Morrison has briefed me on your background, your prosecution record, and your performance in yesterday's interviews. I'm impressed, Miss Hayes. Very impressed. I found myself standing straighter even though no one could see me. Thank you, sir. I'm honored to be considered. I'm going to be direct with you, because that's how I prefer to operate. The position of Attorney General requires someone who can handle pressure from all directions: Congress, the media, special interest groups, even other branches of government. It requires someone who can make difficult decisions based on law and precedent, not political convenience. He paused, and I could hear the weight of his office in the silence. More importantly, he continued, it requires someone who understands that justice isn't about being popular, it's about being right, even when being right is costly. Catherine tells me you've already proven you understand that principle. I try to let the law guide my decisions, sir, not politics. That's exactly what I need to hear. Ms. Hayes, I'm prepared to nominate you for Attorney General pending our meeting tomorrow and final security clearance. Are you prepared to accept that nomination? The words hung in the air between us like a bridge I could either cross or walk away from. In the background, I could hear the normal sounds of suburban Saturday morning, families loading grocery carts and planning weekend activities, people living the kind of comfortable, predictable lives that I had always felt too restless to embrace. Yes, sir. I'm prepared to accept. Excellent. We'll discuss the details tomorrow, but I wanted you to hear this directly from me first. Catherine will handle the logistics, but Miss Hayes, I want you to understand something. This nomination will change your life completely. Every decision you've ever made will be scrutinized. Every relationship you've ever had will be examined. Every enemy you've ever made will try to use this opportunity to settle score. I thought about Stephanie's party happening in a few hours, about Patricia's public relief at my departure, about the celebration of distance that was about to become more prophetic than anyone intended. I understand, Mr. President. I'm ready for the scrutiny. Good, because we're going to announce the nomination Monday morning, which means you have about 48 hours to prepare for your life to become very public, very quickly. I'll see you tomorrow at 10. The line went dead, and I stood in the grocery store parking lot, holding my phone like it contained the key to a completely different existence. In less than 48 hours, I would go from being a regional prosecutor that most people had never heard of, to being a national figure whose confirmation hearings would be covered by every major news outlet in the country. The irony was almost overwhelming. I was about to attend a party celebrating my family's relief at my departure, hosted by people who had no idea that their celebration was about to become the most unintentionally accurate prediction of their lives. I bought the ice Stephanie had requested, along with a bottle of champagne that I intended to save for a very different kind of celebration. The drive to my childhood home felt surreal, as if I was watching someone else's life unfold through a windshield that separated me from consequences I wasn't quite ready to face. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I left for college 15 years ago, a tidy colonial, in a neighborhood where conformity was a virtue, and ambition was acceptable as long as it didn't disrupt the social order. Cars were already lining the driveway and spilling onto the street, evidence that Stephanie's invitation list had been as generous as her enthusiasm for my departure. I sat in the rental car for a moment, gathering my thoughts and preparing for what was likely to be the last time I would ever be in this house as just Victoria Hayes, regional prosecutor. The next time I came home, if I ever came home, I would be Victoria Hayes, Attorney General of the United States, assuming the Senate confirmation process went as planned. Stephanie opened the front door before I had even made it up the walkway, her smile bright and slightly manic with the kind of hostess energy that suggested she had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Victoria! Finally, we were starting to think you were going to skip your own farewell party. She hugged me with enthusiasm that felt genuine, which somehow made everything more complicated. Everyone's so excited to see you. Well, excited to say goodbye properly. Anyway, the living room was packed with faces I recognized from childhood, neighbors and family friends and relatives I hadn't seen in years, all gathered to celebrate what they believed was my permanent departure from their lives. The conversations quieted slightly when I entered, that subtle shift that happens when the guest of honor arrives at their own funeral. Patricia approached with a smile that was equal parts maternal warmth and obvious relief. "Victoria, honey, we're so glad you could make it. I was worried when you weren't answering your phone yesterday. I had some work issues to handle," I said, which was technically true even if it didn't capture the magnitude of what those work issues entailed. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. Come on, let me introduce you to some people. Mrs. Patterson is here, and the Johnsons from down the street, and oh, Carl from the hardware store has been asking about you." The next hour passed in a blur of conversations that felt like archaeological expeditions into a version of my life that no longer existed.
People asked about Denver, about my job, about whether I was excited about finally settling down somewhere permanent. The questions were friendly, but carried an undercurrent of assumption that this departure was somehow a correction, a return to proper order after years of geographical and emotional distance. "We always knew Victoria was too smart for her own good," Mrs. Patterson told a group gathered around the kitchen table. "Some children are just born restless, you know. It's probably better for everyone that she's found a place where that energy can be properly channeled." Uncle Jim, my father's brother, raised his beer in what he clearly intended as a toast. "To Victoria, who's finally figuring out that family is what you come home to, not what you run away from." The group laughed and raised their glasses, and I felt the familiar sensation of being discussed rather than included, analyzed rather than understood. They were celebrating my departure as proof that their way of life was ultimately superior, that my years of ambitious distance had been a phase that was finally ending in surrender to their values. If only they knew. Stephanie clinked her glass with a knife, calling for attention from the assembled crowd. "Everyone, I want to say a few words about Victoria before she heads off to start her new life." The room quieted, and I felt the weight of 24 pairs of eyes evaluating me with the kind of fond condescension usually reserved for prodigal children who had finally learned their lesson. "Victoria has always been different," Stephanie began, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a eulogy for a difficult but ultimately beloved relative. "She's always wanted more than what the rest of us were satisfied with. She's always been driven to prove something that the rest of us never quite understood." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, heads nodding in recognition of a familiar family narrative. "But now she's finally found a place where that drive can take her away from us permanently," Stephanie continued, "and honestly, I think that's what's best for everyone. Victoria needs to be somewhere that matches her energy, and we need to be able to have family gatherings without feeling like we're constantly being judged for not being ambitious enough." The crowd laughed appreciatively, and I realized that Stephanie wasn't being cruel. She genuinely believed she was being generous, offering me permission to be myself somewhere else while freeing the family from the burden of trying to understand who that self was. "So here's to Victoria," she concluded, raising her glass, "and to finally getting the distance that we all need to be happy." The toast was enthusiastic, genuine, and completely devastating in its casual dismissal of everything I had built and achieved. They weren't just celebrating my departure. They were celebrating their relief at no longer having to pretend that my success mattered to them. I raised my glass and smiled, feeling the weight of tomorrow's phone call from the president, the weight of Monday's nomination announcement, the weight of a future that would make this moment seem like a scene from someone else's life. "Thank you," I said to the assembled crowd. "This really is exactly what I needed to hear." The party continued around me, but I felt increasingly like I was watching it from a great distance, as if I had already left not just geographically but existentially. These people who had known me since childhood, who had watched me grow up and succeed and build a life beyond their understanding, were celebrating the end of their obligation to acknowledge that growth. They wanted me gone, and they were about to get their wish in ways that would exceed their wildest expectations. The only question was whether they would still be celebrating when they understood what they had actually wished for. My phone buzzed with a text message from James Mitchell. "Security briefing scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Media strategy meeting Monday morning. Are you ready for this?" I typed back. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." Around me, the party continued, voices growing louder with alcohol and satisfaction, everyone convinced that they had finally solved the Victoria problem through the simple expedient of permanent geographical distance. If only they knew that distance was about to become the least significant change in the equation. Some celebrations deserved to be exactly as prophetic as the hosts intended. And some departures were worth making permanent, especially when they led to destinations that redefined power itself. Monday morning dawned with the kind of crisp clarity that makes Washington, D.C. feel like the center of the universe, which in many ways it was. I stood in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, wearing my best Navy suit and trying to process the fact that in approximately 30 minutes, my life would become public property in ways I was only beginning to understand. President Harrison entered with the kind of quiet authority that filled rooms without effort, followed by a small entourage of staff members whose faces I had seen in news coverage but never imagined meeting in person. The weight of the moment settled over me like a blanket, heavy but not uncomfortable. "Ms. Hayes," the president said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. "Ready to make history?" "As ready as anyone can be for this, sir." The next 20 minutes were a whirlwind of final briefings, security protocols, and strategic guidance that would have felt surreal if I hadn't already spent the weekend adjusting to the impossible becoming inevitable. Chief of Staff Williams reviewed the timeline for confirmation hearings, the media strategy for the announcement, and the kinds of questions I should expect from senators who would view my nomination as everything from a historic opportunity to a political threat. "The opposition research is already underway," Williams warned. "They'll go after your prosecution record, your political affiliations, your personal relationships. They'll find every difficult decision you've ever made and frame it as evidence of bias or incompetence. And they'll find your family's very public celebration of your departure," added Communications Director Sarah Chen, pulling up Stephanie's social media posts on her tablet. "They'll use this to paint you as someone who can't maintain personal relationships, someone whose own family is relieved to see them go." I looked at the screenshots of Stephanie's LinkedIn post, the Facebook photos from Saturday's party, the comments from neighbors and family friends expressing their relief at my permanent departure. 48 hours ago, these posts had been personal humiliation. Now they were political ammunition. "How do we handle that narrative?" I asked. President Harrison leaned forward. "By controlling it. By making it clear that your family's discomfort with your ambition says more about their limitations than yours. By turning their celebration of your departure into evidence of exactly the kind of independent thinking we need in an attorney general." The press conference was scheduled for noon, which gave us just enough time for final preparations and a security briefing that made me realize how completely my life was about to change. Secret Service protection, secured transportation, background investigations that would examine every relationship I had ever had and every decision I had ever made. "Ms. Hayes," the president said as we prepared to walk to the briefing room, "I want you to remember something. The people who are about to oppose this nomination will try to make you smaller, to reduce your qualifications to political talking points. Don't let them. You've earned this position through merit, dedication, and results. Let that record speak for itself." The White House briefing room felt like the epicenter of democracy, filled with reporters whose questions could shape public opinion and political futures. As President Harrison announced my nomination for Attorney General, I watched faces in the crowd shift from surprise to calculation, already processing how this news would play with their audiences and their sources. Victoria Hayes represents exactly the kind of prosecutorial experience and independent judgment that this position requires, the president said. Her record speaks for itself. Federal convictions in organized crime, white-collar fraud, and public corruption cases. A reputation for integrity that has earned respect from colleagues across the political spectrum. The questions came immediately, sharp and probing, in ways that made it clear the opposition research had already begun. "Mr. President, Ms. Hayes has been described by her own family as difficult to work with, someone who prioritizes career advancement over personal relationships. How do you respond to concerns about her ability to collaborate with Congress and other stakeholders?" I felt the familiar sensation of being reduced to someone else's interpretation of my character. But this time the stakes were higher than family dinner conversations. President Harrison's response was swift and decisive. I'd rather have an attorney general who's considered difficult by people who don't understand ambition than one who's considered easy by people who do understand corruption. Ms. Hayes' record shows consistent principled decision-making, regardless of political pressure or personal consequences. Ms. Hayes, another reporter called out, "Your sister recently posted on social media about the family being relieved by your permanent departure. Can you comment on what that says about your ability to maintain working relationships?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized this was the moment that would define how I handled personal attacks for the duration of my public career. My family has always struggled to understand why someone would choose public service over private comfort, I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. They see my commitment to federal prosecution as a rejection of their values because they've never understood that some people are called to serve something larger than their immediate community. Their discomfort with my choices says nothing about my ability to work with people who share a commitment to justice and the rule of law. The follow-up questions came quickly, but I could see in the reporters' faces that my answer had shifted the narrative from personal failure to principled independence. The story wasn't going to be about a woman whose own family rejected her. It was going to be about a prosecutor whose integrity had cost her personal comfort but earned her professional respect. The press conference ended with President Harrison's final statement of confidence, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. Confirmation hearings would start within 2 weeks, giving opposition researchers and political strategists just enough time to build whatever case they could against my nomination. That afternoon, I sat in a secure conference room in the Justice Department, reviewing preparation materials for the confirmation process while my phone buzzed continuously with calls from reporters, colleagues, and people I hadn't heard from in years. But it was the call from Natalie Rodriguez that I answered first. "Victoria, holy shit," she said without preamble. "Attorney General? I knew you were ambitious, but this is insane." "It's been a surreal few days," I admitted. "I've been monitoring social media since the announcement," Natalie continued. "Your sister's posts are going viral, but not in the way she probably intended. People are using them as examples of families not understanding successful women, not as evidence that you're difficult to work with." She paused, and I could hear her typing in the background. "There's something else, though. I've been tracking the response from your hometown, and it's complicated. Some people are embarrassed by the Saturday party, realizing they publicly celebrated rejecting someone who was about to become one of the most powerful people in government. But others are doubling down, saying this proves you were always too big for your britches. What about my family? Radio silence since this morning. No social media posts, no public comments. I think they're in shock." That evening, I finally listened to the voicemails that had been accumulating since the press conference. Colleagues offering congratulations. Law school professors expressing pride. Former opponents acknowledging my qualifications, despite political differences. But it was the message from Patricia that made me sit down in my hotel room and really process what had happened. "Victoria, honey, I don't understand any of this. The reporters keep calling, asking about Saturday's party, asking about things I said on Facebook. I never meant for any of this to become public. I thought you were finally going to settle down somewhere, and maybe we could have normal family dinners without feeling like we were disappointing you all the time." Her voice cracked slightly, and I realized that for the first time in my adult life, Patricia sounded uncertain, vulnerable, out of her depth. "I don't know what to say to these reporters, Victoria. I don't know how to explain that we love you, but we just never understood why you needed so much more than what we had. I don't know how to make this right." The message ended, and I stared at my phone for a long time, thinking about the complexity of family relationships and the ways that success could feel like betrayal to people who had never imagined that kind of success was possible. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was James Mitchell. "Victoria, we need to talk about the confirmation timeline. Senator Williams has already announced his intention to oppose the nomination. He's calling you a political opportunist who built her career by prosecuting Republicans while protecting Democrats. That's not true, and he knows it. Truth isn't the point. Politics is the point. He's going to use the Morrison case, your family's situation, anything he can find to paint you as someone who can't be trusted with impartial law enforcement. I thought about Senator Williams, one of the 4 senators who had called the Attorney General during my prosecution of the Morrison case, trying to pressure for leniency for defendants with congressional connections. Let him try, I said. I have evidence of those phone calls, and I have 8 years of prosecution records that show I don't play political favorites. Good. Because confirmation hearings start Monday, and this is going to get ugly before it gets better. That night, I sat in my hotel room overlooking the Potomac River, thinking about the distance between where I had been a week ago and where I was now. 7 days ago, I had been a successful but regional prosecutor whose biggest concern was my family's indifference to my achievements. Now I was a national figure whose family's indifference had become political ammunition in a confirmation battle that would determine not just my future, but the future of federal law enforcement. The irony was that Stephanie's farewell party had become the perfect metaphor for what was happening now. My family had celebrated getting rid of me, convinced that distance would solve the problem of my inconvenient ambition. Now that distance was about to become permanent in ways they never intended, and the celebration was turning into something they couldn't control or contain. Some wishes come true exactly as requested, just not in the ways the wishers expected, and some departures become arrivals at destinations that redefine power itself. Tomorrow, the confirmation hearings would begin, and I would either become the youngest Attorney General in recent history, or a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition. Either way, my family's wish for permanent distance was about to be granted in the most spectacular way possible. 3 months after my confirmation as Attorney General, I stood in my office on the 5th floor of the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building, looking out at Pennsylvania Avenue and thinking about the strange mathematics of distance and achievement. The view from my window encompassed the Capitol building, the White House, and monuments to democracy that I now had a constitutional responsibility to protect and serve. The confirmation hearings had been every bit as brutal as James Mitchell had predicted. Senator Williams had indeed tried to use the Morrison case against me, painting my prosecution of his allies as evidence of political bias. He had brought up my family's celebration of my departure, questioning whether someone whose own relatives were relieved to see them go could be trusted with national law enforcement, but the strategy had backfired in ways that still surprised me. When Senator Williams read Stephanie's LinkedIn post into the congressional record, describing how families work better when everyone knows their place, the response from the public had been swift and decisive. Editorial boards across the country had condemned the use of family dysfunction as a disqualification for public service. Women's organizations had rallied around my nomination, framing the confirmation fight as a broader question about whether successful women could serve at the highest levels without having their personal relationships weaponized against them. The confirmation vote had been closer than anyone wanted, but it had been enough. 53 senators had voted to confirm, including 3 Republicans who had crossed party lines to support what they called a prosecutor with an uncompromising commitment to the rule of law. Now, 3 months into the job, I was discovering that being Attorney General was everything I had imagined, and nothing I had prepared for. The cases that crossed my desk involved national security, international law, constitutional questions that would shape federal jurisprudence for decades. The responsibility was exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. My phone buzzed with a message from Deputy Attorney General Chen, who had become not just a colleague but a mentor in navigating the political dimensions of federal law enforcement. SCOTUS ruling came down on the Morrison appeals. Unanimous affirmation. Your prosecution strategy is now constitutional precedent. I smiled, remembering the case that had defined my reputation and nearly derailed my confirmation. The Supreme Court's unanimous ruling meant that my approach to prosecuting political corruption had been vindicated at the highest level of American jurisprudence. More importantly, it meant that future prosecutors would have clearer guidelines for handling cases that involved powerful defendants with political connections. The irony wasn't lost on me that Senator Williams, who had tried to use the Morrison case to disqualify me, was now facing his own federal investigation for campaign finance violations. I had recused myself from any involvement in that case, but I couldn't help appreciating the poetic justice of a man who had questioned my integrity now being scrutinized by prosecutors who had learned from my example. The security briefing on Saturday morning felt like stepping into an alternate universe where my life had become a matter of national importance. I sat in a windowless conference room in downtown Washington, surrounded by people whose job it was to know everything about threats I had never imagined facing. The lead agent, Special Agent Martinez, had the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she had protected more important people than me, but took the assignment seriously nonetheless. Ms. Hayes, as a cabinet-level nominee, you'll receive security protection starting immediately, she explained, sliding a thick folder across the table. This includes background checks on anyone in your immediate circle, threat assessments based on your prosecution history, and protocols for everything from public appearances to private travel. I opened the folder to find photographs and detailed profiles of people I had prosecuted over the past 8 years, each marked with threat-level assessments and current status updates. Seeing my professional life reduced to a series of potential security risks was both sobering and strangely validating. These weren't just cases I had won. They were enemies I had made in service of justice. The Morrison case defendants are all still incarcerated, but their associates have been monitored since your nomination was announced, Agent Martinez continued. No credible threats so far, but several have made statements to other inmates that suggest they're following your career with interest. What kind of statements? The kind that suggest they view your promotion as validation of their claims that you were politically motivated rather than evidence-driven. They're framing your appointment as proof that the system is rigged, that you were always being groomed for higher office. I thought about the years of careful legal work that had gone into those prosecutions, the meticulous attention to evidence and procedure that had made the convictions stick. The idea that my methodical approach was being reinterpreted as political strategy would have been insulting if it weren't so predictable. There's something else, Agent Martinez said, pulling out a separate file. Your family situation has generated its own security considerations. She showed me printouts of social media posts, not just from Saturday's party, but from months of previous family communications that I had never paid attention to. Stephanie's regular complaints about my absence from family events, Patricia's comments about my priorities, extended family members sharing articles about successful women who had sacrificed family relationships for career advancement. The narrative that's emerging online is complex, Agent Martinez explained. Some people are using your family's comments as evidence that you're difficult to work with, emotionally unstable, or disconnected from normal human relationships. But others are rallying around you as an example of a successful woman being punished for her achievements. She pulled up a Twitter thread that had apparently gone viral overnight. Someone had screenshotted Stephanie's LinkedIn post about the family being relieved by my departure and added commentary about the ways that ambitious women are made to feel guilty for pursuing careers that take them beyond their family's comfort zones. The response has been overwhelmingly supportive, Agent Martinez continued, but it's also generated pushback from people who believe that family relationships are a legitimate measure of character. The debate is getting heated, and some of the comments are crossing into personal attack territory. I scrolled through hundreds of responses, ranging from thoughtful analysis of gender dynamics in professional advancement to vicious personal attacks on both me and my family. People were dissecting every aspect of my relationship with Patricia and Stephanie, psychoanalyzing family photos, and constructing elaborate theories about why successful women often struggle with traditional family dynamics. The security concern, Agent Martinez said, is that this level of public attention on your personal relationships could generate targeted harassment or worse. People who feel strongly about family values might view your nomination as a threat to traditional social structures. And people who support my nomination might view my family as symbols of everything wrong with small-town thinking, I added, beginning to understand the full scope of what was happening. Exactly. You're not just a nominee anymore, Ms. Hayes. You're a symbol. And symbols attract both devotion and hatred in ways that individuals don't. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from travel protocols to communication security, but my mind kept returning to the strange transformation that was happening around my family relationships. What had been private dysfunction was becoming public allegory, with people I had never met taking sides in arguments about ambition, family loyalty, and the price of success. When I left the security briefing, I had 3 missed calls from Natalie Rodriguez and a text message that simply said, "We need to talk. Now." I called her back while walking to my hotel, and she answered before the first ring had finished. "Victoria, have you seen the news coverage from your hometown?" "What news coverage?" "Local reporters are interviewing people from Saturday's party. Your sister is giving statements to anyone who will listen, and it's not going well." She texted me a link to a local news website, and I opened it to find a video interview with Stephanie standing in front of our childhood home, looking simultaneously defiant and overwhelmed. The headline read, "Sister of Attorney General nominee defends family's, quote, farewell celebration." I played the video, and Stephanie's voice filled my earpiece with a mixture of justification and barely controlled panic. "People are trying to make this into something it wasn't," she said to the reporter. "We love Victoria. We've always loved Victoria. We just wanted to give her a proper send-off because we knew she was going to be far away for a long time. We never meant anything mean by it." The reporter pressed her. "But social media posts suggest the family was celebrating being finally free of Victoria's presence. How do you explain that?" Stephanie's composure cracked slightly. "Look, Victoria has always been intense. She's always made the rest of us feel like we weren't doing enough, achieving enough, being enough. Sometimes families need space from that kind of pressure. That doesn't mean we don't love her." "Do you regret the way the farewell party was framed?" "I regret that people are twisting our words into something ugly. We were trying to be supportive of Victoria's choices, even if we didn't always understand them. Now people are acting like we're terrible people for having normal family dynamics." The interview continued, but I stopped watching. Stephanie wasn't being malicious, but she also wasn't helping. Every attempt to explain the family's behavior was inadvertently confirming the narrative that they had viewed my success as a burden to be relieved, rather than an achievement to be celebrated. "It gets worse," Natalie said. "Your mother gave an interview to the Chicago Tribune. Patricia is not good at damage control." She sent me another link, this one, to a major newspaper article with the headline, "Attorney General nominee's mother speaks about daughter's difficult ambition." I opened it with a sense of dread that proved entirely justified. The article was a masterclass in unintentional character assassination. Patricia had clearly tried to be supportive, but every quote seemed designed to reinforce the worst possible interpretation of my character and our family dynamics. "Victoria has always been driven to prove herself," Patricia was quoted as saying. "Even as a little girl, she couldn't just be satisfied with being good at something. She had to be the best, and she had to make sure everyone knew she was the best." It was exhausting for the rest of us. The reporter had asked about my law career, and Patricia's response was devastating in its casual dismissal. "We're proud of her success, of course, but sometimes I wonder if she chose such a demanding career because she enjoyed being too busy for family obligations. It was always easier for Victoria to send money for birthdays than to actually show up for them." "Do you believe she's qualified for the position of Attorney General?" "I believe Victoria is qualified for any position that requires more work than warmth. She's brilliant, but she's never learned how to just be happy with what she has. She's always needed to be working towards something bigger, something more important than the people around her." I closed the article and sat down on a bench outside the hotel, feeling the weight of public scrutiny in ways I hadn't anticipated. My family's good intentions were somehow making everything worse, confirming every stereotype about ambitious women who sacrifice personal relationships for professional advancement. My phone rang again, this time with a call from James Mitchell. "Victoria, we need to discuss communication strategy," he said, without preamble. "Your family's media interviews are creating complications for the confirmation process. I can't control what they say to reporters." "No, but we can control how we respond to what they're saying. The opposition is already using these interviews as evidence that you prioritize career advancement over personal relationships. Senator Williams is preparing questions about whether someone who can't maintain family harmony can be trusted to manage the complex relationships required for federal law enforcement." I thought about Senator Williams, who had tried to pressure me to go easy on his political allies during the Morrison prosecution. The irony of him questioning my relationship management skills was almost overwhelming. "What do you recommend?" "We recommend that you address this directly in your confirmation testimony. Frame your family's discomfort with your ambition as evidence of your independence, your willingness to make difficult choices without regard for personal popularity. Turn their criticism into proof of exactly the kind of principled decision-making we need in an attorney general. And if they keep giving interviews, then we hope they keep proving our point about the kind of small-minded thinking that holds back talented people. Every time your mother says you were too ambitious for your own good, she's inadvertently arguing that you're exactly the kind of person who won't compromise principles for personal comfort." The call ended, and I sat on the bench outside my hotel, watching Washington, D.C. come alive around me with the energy of a city where everyone understood that ambition was currency, and success was the only meaningful scorecard. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who viewed my drive as an asset rather than a character flaw. That evening, I had dinner with Deputy Attorney General Chen at a small restaurant near Capitol Hill, the kind of place where senators and lobbyists conducted business over expensive wine and carefully worded conversations. It was my first experience with the Washington tradition of mixing social and professional relationships in ways that made every interaction potentially significant. "How are you handling the family situation?" she asked after we had ordered. "I'm learning that privacy is a luxury I no longer have," I said. "Everything I've ever done or said is now fair game for public analysis. It's harder for women," Chen said matter-of-factly. "When men are nominated for senior positions, their family relationships are background information. When women are nominated, their family relationships become evidence of character. You're being held to a standard that no male attorney general has ever faced." She paused to sip her wine, then continued with the kind of strategic thinking that had made her one of the most respected prosecutors in the country. "But you can use that double standard to your advantage. Every time someone questions your family relationships, you can point out that they're applying a gendered standard that has nothing to do with your qualifications. Every time your family's discomfort with your ambition gets highlighted, you can ask why successful women are expected to apologize for the very traits that would be celebrated in men. The confirmation hearings are going to be brutal, aren't they?" "Yes, but they're going to be brutal in ways that ultimately work in your favor. Your opposition is going to overplay their hand, attacking you for character traits that most Americans admire. They're going to make the mistake of treating your ambition like a character flaw instead of a qualification." We talked for another hour about confirmation strategy, media management, and the political dynamics that would shape the next few weeks of my life. But underneath the professional conversation was a deeper understanding about the costs and rewards of being a woman in positions traditionally held by men. "Victoria," Chen said as we prepared to leave, "there's something I want you to understand about this position. Being Attorney General doesn't just change your career, it changes your identity. Everything you do from now on will be interpreted through the lens of your office. Every decision will be analyzed for political motivations. Every relationship will be scrutinized for conflicts of interest. Are you trying to scare me? I'm trying to prepare you. Because once you're confirmed, there's no going back to being a private person. You'll be a public figure for the rest of your life, which means your family's discomfort with your success will always be part of your public narrative." I thought about Stephanie's interview, about Patricia's newspaper quotes, about the viral social media debates that were turning my personal relationships into political allegory. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," I said. "Maybe it's time for families like mine to understand that their comfort isn't more important than their children's potential." Chen smiled. "No, that's the kind of thinking we need in an attorney general." The next morning, I woke up to news that would reshape the entire confirmation process. Senator Williams, who had been leading the opposition to my nomination, had been arrested by federal agents on charges of accepting bribes from defense contractors, the same contractors I had prosecuted in the Morrison case. The arrest was unrelated to my nomination, but the timing was perfect. The senator who had questioned my integrity was now facing the same kind of federal prosecution that had defined my career. The man who had tried to use my family's dysfunction against me was now dealing with his own very public disgrace. By noon, 3 more Republican senators had announced their support for my confirmation, citing the need for prosecutors who can't be bought or intimidated. The political landscape had shifted overnight, and my nomination went from contentious to inevitable. But the most satisfying development came in a phone call from Natalie Rodriguez that afternoon. "Victoria, you need to see what's happening in your hometown," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "The story has completely flipped." She sent me links to local news coverage that showed a very different narrative emerging. Business leaders in Naperville were giving interviews about the importance of supporting local talent who achieved national recognition. The mayor had issued a statement celebrating my nomination as evidence of the quality of education and character development in their community. Even Mrs. Patterson, my third-grade teacher who had celebrated my departure, had given a new interview expressing pride in my achievements and regret about her previous comments. But it was the interview with my high school principal that captured the transformation most clearly. "Victoria Hayes was the kind of student who made everyone around her better," he told the local news station. "She set standards that challenged her classmates to work harder, think deeper, achieve more. Any community would be lucky to produce someone of her caliber." The reporter asked about the family's farewell party and the suggestion that Victoria had been difficult for her family to handle. "Sometimes families struggle to understand children who dream bigger than their immediate environment," the principal replied diplomatically. "That doesn't mean those children are problems to be solved. It means they're gifts to be nurtured." The narrative was shifting from "difficult daughter finally leaves" to, quote, "hometown hero achieves ultimate success." My family's celebration of my departure was being reframed as their failure to recognize my potential rather than evidence of my character flaws. The confirmation hearings were still 2 weeks away, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Senator Williams' arrest had neutralized the main opposition, and the changing narrative around my family relationships had turned what should have been a weakness into a story of triumph over small-minded expectations. That evening, I called Patricia for the first time since the nomination announcement. The conversation was awkward, filled with the kind of careful politeness that families use when they're trying to rebuild bridges that were burned accidentally. "Victoria, honey, I don't know what to say about all this attention," she began. "I never meant for our family business to become public business." "I know, Mom, but maybe it's good that it's public. Maybe other families need to see what happens when success is treated like a character flaw instead of an achievement. I just want you to know that we're proud of you. We've always been proud of you. We just didn't know how to show it in a way that didn't make us feel small." The admission was the most honest thing Patricia had ever said to me about our family dynamics, and it carried the weight of years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. "I love you, Mom," I said, "but I need you to understand that this is who I've always been. I've never been the problem. I've been the solution you weren't ready to recognize." The call ended with promises to do better, to understand better, to support better. But I knew that the real change wasn't going to come from Patricia learning to appreciate my ambition. It was going to come from me finally accepting that I didn't need her appreciation to validate my choices. Some distances were meant to be permanent, not because of anger or resentment, but because they created the space necessary for growth. My family's celebration of my departure had been the last gift they could give me, the final push I needed to stop seeking their approval and start demanding the world's respect. In 2 weeks, I would be confirmed as Attorney General. But the real victory had already happened. I had finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who I was meant to be. The Hart Senate office building on the morning of my confirmation hearings felt like a coliseum designed for intellectual gladiators, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of staffers, journalists, and political operatives who understood that the next few hours would determine not just my future, but the direction of federal law enforcement for years to come. I walked through those corridors with Deputy Attorney General Chen beside me, both of us carrying the weight of preparation that had consumed every waking moment for the past 2 weeks. The hearing room itself was a testament to democratic theater, with tiered seating that allowed senators to look down on witnesses, while cameras captured every gesture and expression for national broadcast. The press gallery was packed with reporters whose articles would shape public perception of both my qualifications and my character. I took my seat at the witness table, adjusted the microphone, and prepared for what would either be the culmination of my legal career or its very public destruction. Chairman Senator Roberts called the hearing to order, with the kind of formal ceremony that made everything feel simultaneously historic and surreal. The opening statements from committee members revealed the battle lines that had been drawn over my nomination, with Democrats praising my prosecution record and Republicans questioning everything from my political motivations to my personal relationships. Senator Williams had been replaced on the committee following his arrest, but his allies had clearly coordinated their attack strategy. Senator Crawford from Texas led off with questions designed to paint me as a political opportunist who had built my career by targeting Republican officials while protecting Democratic allies. "Ms. Hayes," Senator Crawford began, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical skepticism that played well for cable news soundbites. "Your prosecution record shows a curious pattern. In 8 years as a federal prosecutor, you've convicted 17 Republican officials and only 3 Democrats. How do you explain this apparent partisan bias?" I had anticipated this line of attack and prepared extensively for it. But hearing it delivered in the formal setting of a confirmation hearing still made my pulse quicken with both anger and determination. "Senator Crawford," I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional, "I prosecute crimes based on evidence, not party affiliation. If more Republicans were convicted during my tenure, it's because more Republicans committed federal crimes that came to my attention, not because I applied different standards based on political party. But surely you can understand how this pattern raises questions about your impartiality?" "Senator, I can understand how someone might try to use statistics to create a false narrative about bias, but I would invite anyone who questions my impartiality to examine the actual cases. Every conviction was supported by overwhelming evidence. Every prosecution followed department guidelines. Every defendant received due process regardless of their political connections." Senator Crawford leaned forward, clearly preparing for what he believed would be a devastating follow-up question. "Ms. Hayes, we've heard testimony from your own family members suggesting that you prioritize personal advancement over relationships and loyalty. How can we trust someone to manage the complex political relationships required for this position when that person's own mother describes her as emotionally cold and overly ambitious?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized this was the moment that would define not just my confirmation but my entire public identity. Every woman watching this hearing would understand that I was being held to a standard that no male nominee had ever faced, being asked to defend personality traits that would be celebrated in men as evidence of leadership potential. "Senator Crawford," I said, allowing a slight edge to enter my voice, "I find it interesting that you're using my family's discomfort with my ambition as evidence of unfitness for office. My mother has publicly stated that she found my drive to excel exhausting for the rest of the family. I would ask you this: should we discourage prosecutors from being driven to excel? Should we prefer candidates whose families are comfortable with mediocrity?" The room stirred, and I could see surprise in the faces of both supporters and opponents. I had decided to confront the family narrative directly, rather than trying to explain it away. "Furthermore," I continued, "I would note that no male nominee for Attorney General has ever been asked to defend his ambition or apologize for prioritizing professional excellence. The suggestion that my fitness for office should be measured by my family's comfort level with my success is exactly the kind of gender-based double standard that has kept qualified women out of leadership positions for decades." Senator Crawford's prepared follow-up questions suddenly seemed inadequate, and I could see him scrambling to regain control of the narrative he had tried to establish. "Ms. Hayes, this isn't about gender, this is about character and judgment. Senator, when you use my ambition as evidence of character flaws, when you suggest that my professional dedication makes me unfit for leadership, when you cite my family's discomfort with my success as a disqualification for office, you are absolutely making this about gender. You are applying standards to me that would never be applied to a male candidate." The hearing room fell silent, and I could feel the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Camera flashes popped from the press gallery, and I knew that my response would either end my nomination or transform it into something much larger than a simple confirmation process. Senator Rodriguez, the ranking Democrat on the committee, seized the opportunity to redirect the questioning toward my qualifications. "Ms. Hayes, let's talk about your actual record as a prosecutor. Can you walk us through your approach to the Morrison case and how it demonstrates your commitment to impartial law enforcement?" For the next hour, I detailed the Morrison prosecution in ways that highlighted both the complexity of the case and the care I had taken to ensure that political considerations never influenced prosecutorial decisions. I explained how I had documented every attempt at political interference, how I had built an evidence-based case that could withstand any appeal, how I had insisted on following department guidelines even when powerful people suggested I should be more flexible. 3 senators called the Attorney General's office during your prosecution of the Morrison defendants, Senator Rodriguez noted. How did you handle that political pressure? I documented every call, every suggestion, every attempt to influence the prosecution. I made it clear to my superiors that I would not modify my approach based on political considerations. I built a case based on evidence and law, not political convenience. And Senator Williams was one of those senators who called? Senator Williams called twice, suggesting that the prosecution was politically motivated and that I should consider the broader implications of convicting defendants with congressional connections. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room that Senator Williams, who had tried to pressure me to go easy on his political allies, was now himself facing federal corruption charges. The same prosecutorial approach he had tried to undermine was now being applied to his own alleged crimes. Senator Thompson from Montana took a different approach, focusing on my management philosophy and my plans for the Justice Department. His questions allowed me to articulate a vision for federal law enforcement that emphasized both independence and accountability, a balance between respecting local jurisdiction and ensuring consistent application of federal law. Ms. Hayes, how do you view the relationship between federal prosecutors and local law enforcement? I believe in collaborative law enforcement that respects both federal authority and local expertise. Federal prosecutors should focus on crimes that cross state lines, involve federal agencies, or require resources that local authorities don't have. But we should also be partners with local law enforcement, providing support and coordination when needed. And how do you balance prosecutorial independence with political accountability? Prosecutorial independence means making decisions based on law and evidence, not political pressure. Political accountability means being transparent about those decisions and willing to explain them to Congress and the public. The two concepts are complementary, not contradictory. The questioning continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from my views on civil rights enforcement to my plans for modernizing the Justice Department's technology infrastructure. But throughout the hearing, the exchange with Senator Crawford continued to resonate, creating a defining moment that transformed the confirmation process from a simple credential review into a broader discussion about gender, ambition, and leadership. During the lunch break, James Mitchell found me in a secure conference room where I was reviewing notes for the afternoon session. His expression was a mixture of admiration and amazement. Victoria, that exchange with Crawford was brilliant. You didn't just answer his attack, you turned it into an indictment of the double standards applied to women in leadership positions. Social media is exploding with support, and 3 more Republican senators have announced they're voting for confirmation. It felt like the right moment to address it directly, rather than trying to apologize for being ambitious. It was more than right. It was transformative. You've changed the entire narrative, from difficult woman with family problems to, quote, qualified candidate facing gender-based attacks. The opposition doesn't know how to respond to that. The afternoon session focused primarily on policy questions and administrative details, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. Senators who had seemed skeptical in the morning were now asking substantive questions about my plans for the department. Even some Republican members were treating me with a respect that suggested they viewed my confirmation as inevitable. The most dramatic moment came when Senator Parker, a conservative Republican from South Carolina, asked about my prosecution philosophy in terms that seemed designed to elicit a statement he could use against me. Ms. Hayes, some critics have suggested that your prosecution record reflects a bias against traditional values, that you've targeted defendants who represent conservative viewpoints while protecting liberal allies. How do you respond to those charges? I looked directly at Senator Parker, recognizing this as another attempt to paint my record in partisan terms. Senator Parker, I would challenge anyone making that claim to identify a single case where I failed to prosecute someone because of their political views, or where I pursued charges against someone based on their ideology rather than their criminal behavior. But surely you can understand why some people might view your record as politically motivated. Senator, I understand that some people are uncomfortable with prosecutors who can't be pressured, influenced, or deterred by political considerations. The defendants I've convicted had one thing in common. They believed their political connections would protect them from accountability. They were wrong. I paused, letting that statement resonate before continuing. If prosecuting corruption regardless of party affiliation makes someone uncomfortable, if holding powerful people accountable regardless of their political influence seems biased, then I would suggest that the problem isn't with my prosecution record. The problem is with an expectation that prosecutors should consider political factors when deciding whether to pursue justice. The hearing room erupted in applause from the gallery, causing Chairman Roberts to gavel for order, but the damage to the opposition's narrative was complete. Every attempt to paint me as politically biased had been turned into evidence of my independence and integrity. The final hour of testimony covered my vision for the Justice Department, my plans for addressing emerging threats like cybercrime and domestic terrorism, and my commitment to protecting civil rights while maintaining public safety. By the time Chairman Roberts gavelled the hearing to a close, the outcome was no longer in question. That evening, I sat in my hotel room watching cable news coverage of the hearing, while my phone buzzed continuously with calls from supporters, colleagues, and media outlets requesting interviews. The consensus among political analysts was that my confirmation was now certain, that my handling of the gender-based attacks had not only neutralized opposition, but transformed me into a symbol of qualified women overcoming outdated stereotypes. The call I had been both anticipating and dreading came just after 9 o'clock. Patricia's number appeared on my phone screen, and I answered with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Victoria, honey, I watched the whole hearing today," she began, her voice carrying emotions I couldn't quite identify. "I need to apologize to you." "Mom, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. I watched you sit there and defend yourself against questions that no man would ever be asked. I watched you explain why being ambitious and driven should be qualifications for leadership, not character flaws. And I realized that for your entire life, I've been asking you to apologize for the very qualities that made you extraordinary." Patricia's voice cracked slightly, and I realized she was crying. "I watched that senator suggest that my comments about you being difficult made you unfit for office, and I understood for the first time that I haven't been protecting our family from your ambition. I've been protecting our limitations from your potential." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion Patricia and I had ever had about success, family expectations, and the ways that parents sometimes try to keep their children small enough to remain comprehensible. She talked about her fear that my achievements made her own choices seem inadequate, her worry that my independence meant I didn't need family anymore, her confusion about how to love someone whose dreams were bigger than anything she had ever imagined. "Victoria, I want you to know that watching you today made me proud in ways I didn't know were possible. Not just proud of what you've accomplished, but proud of who you are. You didn't back down, you didn't apologize for being brilliant, and you didn't let anyone make you smaller than you are. Thank you, Mom. That means more than you know. I also want you to know that I'm done talking to reporters about our family. I realize now that every time I tried to explain our relationship, I was inadvertently undermining you. From now on, if anyone asks about you, I'm going to tell them to look at your record, not your family dynamics." The call ended with promises to rebuild our relationship on a foundation that celebrated rather than constrained my ambition. But I knew that the real change had already happened. I no longer needed Patricia's approval to feel validated in my choices. Her apology was appreciated, but it wasn't necessary for my sense of self-worth. The confirmation vote took place 3 days later, and the result was more decisive than anyone had predicted. 67 senators voted to confirm my nomination, including 12 Republicans who cited my handling of the family controversy as evidence of the kind of principled leadership the Justice Department needed. Senator Crawford, who had led the attack on my character, issued a statement after the vote that inadvertently validated everything I had argued during the hearing. "While I continue to have concerns about Ms. Hayes' prosecutorial philosophy," he said, "I respect her qualifications and her commitment to the rule of law. I look forward to working with her in her new role." Even in conceding defeat, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his attacks had been based on gender bias rather than legitimate policy concerns. But his careful language confirmed that he understood the political cost of being seen as someone who opposed qualified women because they were too ambitious for traditional comfort zones. The swearing-in ceremony took place the following Monday in the Rose Garden, with President Harrison administering the oath while my new security detail maintained discreet positions around the perimeter. As I raised my right hand and repeated the words that would make me the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States, I thought about the distance between where I had been 3 weeks earlier and where I was now. 3 weeks ago, I had been a successful regional prosecutor whose family celebrated her departure. Now I was Attorney General of the United States, surrounded by people who understood that ambition was a virtue and excellence was an expectation rather than an inconvenience. The reception following the ceremony was attended by federal judges, senior prosecutors, congressional leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. These were people who measured success by impact rather than comfort, who valued results over relationships, who understood that some positions required individuals willing to prioritize justice over popularity. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing on the White House South Lawn, looking across the Potomac toward Arlington Cemetery, and thinking about the strange mathematics of distance and belonging. My family had celebrated getting rid of me because they thought my ambition made family life difficult. They were probably right. But they had also inadvertently celebrated my ascension to a position where that same ambition would serve the entire country. Some wishes come true exactly as requested, just not in the ways the wishers expected. Some departures become arrivals at destinations that redefine not just individual potential, but collective understanding of what leadership looks like. Tomorrow, I would walk into the Justice Department as Attorney General, carrying the authority to shape federal law enforcement policy and the responsibility to ensure that justice remained blind to political pressure. The confirmation battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. My phone buzzed with a text message from Natalie Rodriguez. "Watching the ceremony on TV. You looked like someone who finally found where she belongs." I typed back. I looked like someone who stopped apologizing for being exactly who she was meant to be. The reply came immediately. Same thing. She was right. Belonging wasn't about finding people who accepted your limitations. It was about finding purposes that demanded your potential. I had spent 38 years trying to fit into spaces designed for smaller ambitions. Now I was stepping into a role that required every ounce of drive, intelligence, and independence that had made my family so uncomfortable. Some distances were worth traveling, especially when they led to destinations that transformed individual success into collective service. My family's celebration of my departure had been the last gift they could give me, the final push I needed to stop seeking their approval and start demanding the world's respect. The confirmation hearings had been brutal, but they had also been clarifying. They had forced me to articulate not just my qualifications but my philosophy, not just my experience but my vision. They had turned a simple personnel decision into a broader conversation about gender, ambition, and the qualities required for leadership in the 21st century. Most importantly, they had established that I would serve as Attorney General, on my own terms, with my own standards, according to my own understanding of what justice required. The political pressure that had begun with my family's discomfort with my ambition, and culminated in senatorial questions about my character, had only strengthened my resolve to make decisions based on law and evidence, rather than comfort and convenience. As I walked back toward the White House, surrounded by Secret Service agents who would now be a permanent part of my life, I realized that the real victory wasn't the confirmation vote or the swearing-in ceremony. It was the understanding that I had finally found a position that required everything my family had found difficult about me, and transformed those qualities into public service. They had celebrated getting rid of me, and in a sense, they had been right to celebrate. The Victoria Hayes, who had spent years trying to make them comfortable with her ambition, was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that some positions required individuals willing to be misunderstood by the people closest to them in order to serve the principles that mattered most. The distance they had wanted was now permanent. But it wasn't a rejection, it was a transformation, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months into my tenure as Attorney General, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office in the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building, watching the morning sun illuminate the Supreme Court across the street. The view had become a daily reminder of the constitutional responsibility I carried, the weight of decisions that would shape federal law enforcement for generations. My reflection in the glass showed someone who had grown into power rather than simply acquired it, someone whose confidence came from competence rather than circumstance. The morning briefing with my senior staff had covered the usual array of complex cases and policy decisions that define the Attorney General's daily reality. International cybercrime investigations that required coordination with intelligence agencies across 3 continents. Civil rights enforcement actions that balanced federal authority with local jurisdiction. Congressional oversight hearings that demanded both legal precision and political awareness. Each decision carried consequences that rippled through the justice system and beyond, affecting millions of Americans who would never know my name, but whose lives were touched by the policies I implemented. My assistant knocked before entering with the kind of careful deference that had replaced the casual familiarity of my Denver office. Ms. Attorney General, you have the Harvard Law Review interview in 20 minutes, and the President's office called to confirm your briefing this afternoon on the Domestic Terrorism Task Force recommendations. The transformation of my daily routine still struck me as surreal sometimes. 6 months ago, my biggest concerns had been case preparation deadlines and local media coverage of high-profile prosecutions. Now my calendar included meetings with cabinet secretaries, briefings with intelligence officials, and congressional testimony that would be analyzed by legal scholars and political commentators for years to come. But it was the personal transformations that proved most profound. The ways that stepping into ultimate authority had clarified not just my professional identity, but my understanding of family, loyalty, and the price of excellence. The distance my family had celebrated as liberation had become the foundation for a relationship built on mutual respect rather than frustrated expectations. The Harvard Law Review interview was conducted by Professor Margaret Chen, a constitutional law scholar whose questions revealed both deep knowledge of my prosecutorial record and genuine curiosity about the political dynamics of my confirmation process. We sat in my private conference room, the walls lined with portraits of former attorneys general who had faced their own challenges in balancing law enforcement independence with political accountability. General Hayes, Professor Chen began, using the formal title that still felt strange after months of hearing it. Your confirmation hearings generated significant discussion about gender bias in the evaluation of female candidates for senior positions. How has that experience influenced your approach to leadership at the Justice Department? I considered the question carefully, thinking about the ways that surviving gender-based attacks had actually strengthened my authority, rather than undermining it. The confirmation process taught me that attempting to minimize my ambition or apologize for my qualifications would have been both dishonest and counterproductive. The same traits that some people found threatening in a candidate became assets in the position itself. Can you elaborate on that? The willingness to make unpopular decisions, the commitment to principles over relationships, the ability to withstand personal criticism while maintaining professional focus. These aren't character flaws that I needed to overcome. They're leadership qualities that the position requires. Professor Chen leaned forward with the intensity of someone pursuing a particularly important line of inquiry. Your family situation became quite public during the confirmation process. How do you view that experience now? The question touched on territory that remained tender, despite the months that had passed. My relationship with Patricia and Stephanie had evolved into something more honest, but also more distant, built on acceptance of fundamental differences rather than attempts to bridge them. My family's discomfort with my ambition was real and long-standing, I said carefully, but their public expression of that discomfort during the confirmation process inadvertently highlighted broader social attitudes about successful women. Their celebration of my departure said more about societal expectations than it did about my character. Do you regret the way that situation unfolded? I regret that private family dynamics became public political theater. But I don't regret that the conversation happened. Too many qualified women have been held back by the expectation that they should prioritize family comfort over professional excellence. If my experience helps change that expectation, then the personal cost was worth it. The interview continued for another hour, covering my management philosophy, my vision for federal law enforcement reform, and my thoughts on the balance between prosecutorial independence and democratic accountability. But the questions about family and gender dynamics remained the most revealing, forcing me to articulate lessons I was still learning about power, success, and the different prices that men and women pay for leadership positions. That afternoon's briefing with President Harrison took place in the Oval Office, surrounded by the formal majesty of American democracy and the informal energy of a working presidency. The president had called the meeting to review my recommendations for a new domestic terrorism task force, but the conversation quickly expanded to broader questions of justice policy and political strategy. Victoria, I want your assessment of how the confirmation battle affected your authority within the department, President Harrison said, settling back in his chair with the relaxed attention of someone comfortable with power. Has the public nature of that process made it easier or harder to manage senior staff? The question revealed the kind of strategic thinking that had made him a successful president, the understanding that personal authority and institutional effectiveness were inextricably linked. Easier, in most ways, I replied. The confirmation process established that I'm willing to defend unpopular positions and withstand personal attacks. That's given me credibility with career prosecutors who need to know their leadership won't cave to political pressure. And the family situation? Has that created ongoing complications? It's actually been clarifying. The staff understands that I prioritize institutional interests over personal relationships. That creates confidence in my decision-making process. President Harrison nodded thoughtfully. The political analysts tell me that your confirmation helped us with suburban women voters, that your handling of the gender-based attacks resonated beyond the legal community. Are you comfortable with that kind of symbolic role? The question touched on something I had been grappling with since taking office. The ways that my personal story had become part of broader political narratives about women in leadership. I'm comfortable being an example of what's possible when qualified women are judged on their merits, rather than their conformity to traditional expectations. If that helps other women pursue leadership positions, then I'm proud to play that role. The briefing concluded with the president's approval of my domestic terrorism task force recommendations, and his request that I continue to be visible in media appearances that highlighted the administration's commitment to professional law enforcement. Walking back through the West Wing corridors, I reflected on how completely my life had changed from the regional prosecutor who had dreaded family gatherings to the cabinet member who briefed presidents on national security matters. The real measure of that transformation became clear that evening when I received an unexpected phone call from Stephanie. Our conversations had become infrequent since the confirmation hearings, characterized by careful politeness rather than genuine intimacy. But her voice that night carried a different quality. Urgent and emotional in ways that suggested something significant had happened. Victoria, I need to tell you something, she began without preamble. I've been thinking about everything that happened with your nomination, everything I said in those interviews, and I need you to understand something. What's going on, Stephanie? I got offered a promotion at work today, regional sales director for the entire Midwest. It's a big job, lots of travel, lots of responsibility. The kind of position I never thought I was qualified for. She paused, and I could hear the complexity of emotions in her silence. When they offered it to me, my first thought was that I couldn't take it, because it would mean missing family events, being too busy for normal relationships, becoming the kind of person who puts work before everything else. And then I realized I was describing you, and everything I used to criticize about your choices. The admission carried weight that went beyond simple acknowledgement of past mistakes. It suggested a fundamental shift in how Stephanie understood success, ambition, and the different paths that people take toward fulfillment. I took the job, Victoria, and when I called Mom to tell her, she was proud. Not worried, not concerned about how it would affect family dynamics. Proud. And I realized that watching you become Attorney General taught her something about celebrating achievement instead of fearing it. I'm glad you took the job, Stephanie. You'll be great at it. I also want to apologize for that farewell party, for the interviews, for all the ways I made your success about my insecurity. I understand now that you weren't rejecting us by pursuing bigger opportunities. You were showing us what was possible if we stopped being afraid of our own potential. The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion Stephanie and I had ever had about family expectations, personal ambition, and the ways that success could feel threatening to people who had never imagined achieving it themselves. She talked about years of feeling overshadowed by my accomplishments, of interpreting my independence as criticism of her choices, of celebrating my departure because it relieved her of the constant comparison. But watching you handle those confirmation hearings changed something for me. She continued. Seeing you refuse to apologize for being excellent made me realize that I had been apologizing for wanting more than what I already had. You didn't just win that confirmation battle, Victoria. You showed me permission to want things I had been afraid to pursue. The call ended with plans to have dinner during my next trip to Chicago, the first time in years that either of us had suggested spending time together without the obligation of family events or holiday traditions. It felt like the beginning of a relationship based on mutual respect rather than shared history, built on understanding rather than assumption. But the most profound conversation came 2 weeks later, during a rare evening when my security detail was minimal, and I could walk through downtown Washington with something approaching normal privacy. I had dinner with Natalie Rodriguez at a small restaurant near Capitol Hill, the kind of place where political professionals gathered to decompress from the intensity of government work. Victoria, I've been covering politics for 15 years, Natalie said as we shared a bottle of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. I've seen a lot of confirmation battles, a lot of personal attacks, a lot of qualified people destroyed by the process. But I've never seen anyone transform the attacks into such complete victory. I got lucky with the timing of Senator Williams's arrest. That wasn't luck, that was justice. The same principles that guided your prosecution of corruption cases protected you when you became the target of political corruption. The system worked because you had made it work. We talked about the strange journey from Denver prosecutor to cabinet member, about the personal costs and professional rewards of stepping into ultimate authority. But it was Natalie's observation about my family situation that proved most insightful. You know what's interesting about your story? She said. Your family thought they were celebrating getting rid of a problem, but they were actually celebrating the launch of someone who was meant for something much bigger than what they could imagine. Their farewell party wasn't the end of your relationship with them. It was the beginning of your relationship with your actual potential. I never thought about it that way. They wanted distance because they couldn't handle your ambition, but that distance created the space you needed to pursue opportunities that your ambition deserved. Their discomfort with your success became the catalyst for success beyond anything they had considered possible. The insight felt profound because it reframed the entire narrative of family rejection and personal triumph. My family's celebration of my departure hadn't been a wound to overcome. It had been a gift to accept, the final permission I needed to stop constraining my ambitions to fit their comfort zones. 6 months later, I received an invitation that crystallized the transformation of my relationship with both my family and my hometown. Northwestern University was awarding me an honorary doctorate, and the ceremony would include a speech about public service and the importance of pursuing excellence regardless of personal cost. The invitation specifically mentioned that the speech would be covered by national media and attended by legal scholars, federal judges, and government officials from across the country. I called Patricia to tell her about the honor, and her response revealed how completely our dynamic had shifted. "Victoria, that's wonderful," she said with enthusiasm that sounded genuine rather than obligatory. "Stephanie and I want to come to the ceremony. We want to be there to support you and to show that we understand now what we should have understood all along. You don't have to come if it's not comfortable. Honey, we want to come because we're proud of you, not proud despite your ambition, but proud because of it. We want to be there when you're recognized for everything you've achieved, everything you've become." The ceremony took place on a perfect spring day in Evanston, with Lake Michigan providing a backdrop that reminded me of the dreams I had harbored as a young law student. As I stood at the podium in my academic robes, looking out at an audience that included my family, my staff, and distinguished guests from across the legal profession, I felt the weight of both accomplishment and responsibility. My speech focused on the importance of pursuing justice even when it required personal sacrifice, even when it meant disappointing people who preferred comfort to excellence. I talked about the price of independence and the rewards of integrity, about the ways that principled leadership sometimes required accepting misunderstanding from the people closest to you. Excellence is not a character flaw that requires apology, I said near the conclusion of my remarks. Ambition is not a disruption that families should celebrate ending. The pursuit of justice, the commitment to something larger than immediate comfort, the willingness to be misunderstood in service of principles that matter, these are not problems to be solved, but gifts to be cherished. The applause was sustained and genuine, but it was the sight of Patricia and Stephanie in the front row, both visibly moved by my words, that felt most meaningful. They had traveled from Naperville not to celebrate my departure, but to witness my recognition, not to mark the end of their obligation to understand me, but to show their newfound appreciation for who I had always been. The reception afterward was filled with conversations about legal precedent, policy implications, and career opportunities. But the most important exchange happened when Patricia approached me as the evening was winding down. "Victoria, I want you to know that listening to your speech tonight made me understand something I should have realized years ago," she said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion. "You were never the problem in our family. We were. We tried to make you smaller because we couldn't imagine being bigger ourselves. Mom, we don't need to rehash. Yes, we do. Because I need you to understand that the distance we celebrated wasn't just geographical. It was the distance between who we were and who you were meant to become. We were celebrating our limitations, not your departure." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion Patricia and I had ever had about success, family dynamics, and the different ways that people pursue meaning in their lives. She talked about her fear that my achievements made her own choices seem inadequate, her confusion about how to support dreams she couldn't understand, her gradual realization that holding me back had been an attempt to validate her own decisions to stay small. "Watching you become Attorney General taught me that some people are meant for extraordinary things," she continued. "And families that truly love those people need to learn how to celebrate their extraordinariness, instead of trying to contain it." As I drove back to Washington that night, surrounded by the security detail that had become a permanent part of my life, I reflected on the strange journey from family disappointment to national recognition. The farewell party that Stephanie had thrown to celebrate my departure had indeed been prophetic, but not in the ways anyone had intended. They had celebrated the end of their obligation to accommodate my ambition within their comfort zones. What they hadn't realized was that they were also celebrating the beginning of my opportunity to pursue that ambition, without the constraint of their expectations. The distance they had wanted had become the space I needed to transform from a regional prosecutor into the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. The real victory wasn't the confirmation vote or the honorary doctorate or the recognition from legal scholars. It was the understanding that some forms of success require accepting misunderstanding from the people closest to you, and that accepting that misunderstanding can be the most loving thing you do for both yourself and them. My family had gotten exactly what they wished for. I had left their immediate world permanently, pursuing opportunities that took me far beyond their ability to influence or constrain. But in getting their wish, they had also learned to appreciate rather than resent the qualities that had made that departure inevitable. The drive back to Washington felt like a meditation on the mathematics of distance and belonging, on the ways that physical separation could create emotional clarity, on the difference between being rejected and being released. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, law school friends, and political contacts, all celebrating the honorary doctorate and discussing policy implications of my recent speeches. But the message that mattered most came from Stephanie. "Watching you tonight made me proud to be your sister. Not proud despite your success, but proud because of everything you've become. Thank you for showing me what's possible when someone refuses to apologize for being excellent." Some celebrations prove more prophetic than their hosts intend. Some departures become arrivals at destinations that redefine not just individual potential, but collective understanding of what families can accomplish when they learn to nurture, rather than constrain exceptional talent. 6 years after a farewell party that celebrated my permanent departure, I had indeed left their world permanently. But I had also shown them possibilities they had never imagined, standards they had never considered, achievements they had never thought to pursue. The distance they had celebrated had become the space where extraordinary things became possible, where ambition became service, where individual success became collective inspiration. The Attorney General's motorcade pulled into the Justice Department complex just after midnight, and I walked through corridors lined with portraits of predecessors who had faced their own challenges in balancing personal relationships with professional responsibilities. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new policies, new decisions that would affect millions of Americans who depended on federal law enforcement to protect their rights and safety. But tonight, I felt the satisfaction of understanding that the journey from family disappointment to national recognition had been worth every moment of misunderstanding, every hour of loneliness, every celebration of departure that had actually been a celebration of arrival at exactly where I was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.